In the last lecture, we looked at very low frequency and extremely low frequency radio waves. Today, we will focus on the radio bands from low frequency through to very high frequency, also called VHF. These are commonly called radio frequency waves, and you've guessed it, they're used in AM and FM radio transmissions. Later on, we will talk more about radio transmissions and other uses of radio waves. We will also look at the history behind the discovery of radio waves and the surprising places where it could come from. Radio frequency waves are radiations with frequencies from 30 kHz up to 300 MHz, or wavelengths between 10 kilometers and 1 meter. So given the electromagnetic spectrum, you will notice that these wavelengths are becoming shorter, with higher frequencies and higher energy. You'll have noticed that the unit of frequency is called hertz. Why hertz? Well, it's because they take their name from the person who made an enormous contribution to our knowledge of electromagnetic radiation, including the discovery of radio waves. His name was Heinrich Hertz. Heinrich Hertz was a German physicist. He was also the first to prove the existence of radio waves back in 1886. About 20 years before that, James Clerk Maxwell had published his theory of electromagnetism. Maxwell unified the known laws of electricity and magnetism and proposed that light waves were transverse electromagnetic waves. Hertz was a brilliant theorist and experimenter. He firstly rederived Maxwell's equations based on an alternative approach. This work impacted on later design of his experiments, in which he set out to investigate electromagnetism. In other words, Hertz was purposefully trying to generate and detect electromagnetic waves in order to test the predictions of Maxwell's theory. Hertz had been experimenting with Knockinghauer spirals. These are large flat coils of copper wire with spheres at the end of each of the two coils called a spark gap. Hertz had noticed that when he passed a large charge through the top two terminals, then sparks were also produced between the terminals at the bottom end of the spiral. Hertz continued to experiment with spark gaps, building his own simple transmitter. He used an induction coil to create electrical sparks across the small gap between the two zinc spheres. These sparks created waves that could be picked up by a receiving antenna, causing sparks to jump a gap as well. Further experiments confirmed that these waves had all the properties of electromagnetic waves. Hertz had discovered radio waves. He gradually refined his apparatus, building a smaller setup that produced microwaves. Hertz was the first person to deliberately generate, transmit, and detect electromagnetic waves at a frequency lower than light. That is, radio waves and microwaves. And he directly confirmed Maxwell's theory. Remember when we said that thunderstorms can produce radio waves? Well, Hertz's experiments demonstrate essentially the same thing. The discovery of radio waves opened up a whole new era of science and revolutionized communications. Hertz's work quickly led to the invention of radio wireless telegraph by Guglielmo Marconi, and eventually to radio and TV as we know it today. Now, let's talk about the sources of radio frequency waves. From the last lecture, we learned that radio waves are produced naturally by lightning, solar activity, and most interestingly, many different kinds of astronomical objects. But how do we know that? In the 1930s, an American engineer by the name of Karl Jansky was working for the communications company Bell Laboratories. There, he studied possible sources of interference from shortwave radio that have wavelengths between 10 and 20 meters. Put simply, he was tasked with finding out what sources of radio static might affect radio transmissions. As part of his research, Jansky built a rotating antenna that could determine what direction radio signals were coming from. It was known as Jansky's merry-go-round. To Jansky's great surprise, he discovered a faint but steady signal coming from the center of our Milky Way galaxy. That's right, there are radio waves coming from the center of the Milky Way. Jansky's work opened up a whole new field of scientific research, radio astronomy. In this field, we look at the sky through the radio wavelengths and see objects not observable in the wavelengths of visible light. These include anywhere there is hydrogen gas in the universe, or areas of the galaxies where gas is cool enough for carbon dioxide molecules to exist. Let's look at an example. Here you can see an image of a typical spiral galaxy, similar to our own Milky Way. On the right, you will see what the galaxy would look like through the spectrum of visible light. On the left is what it would look like through the wavelength of radio frequencies, shown in false color, of course. It's amazing, isn't it? Of course, here on Earth, radio waves also bring wonder through the medium of radio. As you know, there are two ways radio is broadcast. These are AM and FM radio. They are different principally in the way that the radio waves are modulated. AM stands for amplitude modulation. Basically, radio waves here are used as a carrier wave for a signal that contains sound information. The amplitude or power of the signal is modulated at a rate that corresponds to frequencies of the audio signal. On the other hand, FM radio uses frequency modulation. This is where the amplitude stays constant, but the frequency of the signal is varied at a rate corresponding to the frequencies of the audio signal. There are also some particular differences between AM and FM radio. Low and medium radio frequencies are used for AM radio, whereas FM radio uses high and very high frequency wavebands. AM waves are more affected by interference from other sources of radio waves in the environment. So when you listen to AM radio, you will notice that some of the information is more easily lost and the sound quality is not as good compared to FM radio. However, since AM radio transmits at a lower frequency compared to FM radio, it has larger wavelengths. This means AM radio can broadcast further than FM radio. Radio waves are also used in the fields of medicine and health. For example, in magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. Here, pulses of radio waves are used to make hydrogen protons in your body resonate or change the direction in which they are spinning. As the pulses are turned off, the protons slowly return to their normal spin state. This process, in turn, emits a radio signal that can be measured by receivers in the machine, making it into a diagnostic image. Radio waves are not dangerous to humans. In fact, we live amongst them all of the time. We are surrounded by radio waves from radio and TV broadcasts. But because they are very low energy waves, they are not ionizing. They do not have enough energy to remove electrons or break molecular bonds. Nevertheless, very high levels of radio frequency radiation can create heat by causing atoms to vibrate. Therefore, they could potentially heat biological tissue. Measurements have shown that levels of radio frequency radiation in the environment are very low, much lower in fact than the Australian safety standards allow for. Only people who work very close with transmitting antennas, radar systems, or industrial heating applications that use radio waves are likely to be at risk of heating from high exposure. In these rare cases, there are strict safety procedures and exposure limits that must be followed. So we've come to the end of this lecture. Today, we learned that radio waves are produced naturally by lightning or other astronomical phenomena. They are also produced artificially by humans for the purposes of radio and TV broadcasts, radio communications, and health applications. In the next lecture, we will be looking at the high energy end of the radio part of the spectrum, which is also known as microwave radiation.